Hi there. Thank you. Good morning. My name is Amber Jameson, and I work with the Environmental Protection Information Center. I wanted to thank you for bringing us here today and providing this opportunity to comment. I strongly support readoption of the Scott and Shasta River emergency regulations, which have provided important protections for salmonids. I also support the board's goal of adopting long-term regulations. I appreciate the board's being proactive to address these issues now rather than in the middle of a crisis so that people can prepare and coordinate for the best possible outcome. My primary concern is that the Scott and Shasta water rights are over allocated. And regardless of the water year type, even with emergency regulations, we're seeing flow issues every year. Since the emergency flows go unmet for weeks at a time, resulting in less than baseline flows, I would consider those essentially extinction flows that further the decline of fisheries. I implore the board to prepare environmental and economic studies that not only include baseline flows, but also recovery flows. And I urge the water board to include an economic analysis of the true costs of not having a harvestable surplus of salmon. In addition to the suicide epidemic that swept the region when fisheries were closed, the effects of an altered diet on the health of Kuduk people was published by Kari Norgard, and that identifies the elimination of salmon and other traditional foods leading to extreme adverse health, social, economic, and spiritual impacts on Kuduk people. Norgard's report has a lot of good facts and data to support these conclusions, and it states that, quote, the loss of traditional food sources is now recognized as being directly responsible for a host of diet and related illnesses among Native Americans, including diabetes, obesity, heart disease, tuberculosis, hypertension, kidney troubles, and strokes. It goes on to state that the estimated diabetes rate for the Kuduk tribe is 21%, nearly 4 times the US average. The estimated rate of heart disease for the Kuduk tribe is 39.6%. That's 3 times the US average. So I implore the board to take into account all of the costs of not having salmon if you're not going to be considering recovery flows. In addition to addressing commercial and recreational salmon fishing in the economic analysis, it's critical that the board take into account the impacts and costs associated with the loss of a traditional-based diet, including salmon. Last year, the local cooperative solutions did not appear to meet the water board requirements for data metering equipment and did not have sufficient metering plans or data available, despite the water board having large quantities of money set aside to give away to people to install meters. So it just shows that like these folks who, are not installing the meters, they're not complying with the plans. I feel like, the transparency is like really essential to build trust. And so I request that the board have more transparency for the public to review and monitor water diversion and extraction data, especially since the Water Board Enforcement Department is driven by public participation. So if people living in the watershed area are not even allowed to see what diversions are permitted, how can violations be reported? At a minimum, I believe that local watershed groups and stakeholders who've been involved in the process should have access to this data. If you guys are afraid of sharing it among the public in general, I think that transparency will help build the trust and compliance among the stakeholders because, there's transparency and people will be held accountable. Also, data transparency should not be traded for more water. I would, implore the board to revisit and amend sections of 875 or section 875 to ensure that information is not treated as a benefit equal to in-stream flow. The regulations need to include provisions to address groundwater extraction also, since it's connected to surface waters, and the extractions resulting in impacts to in-stream flows. Groundwater metering provisions need to be provided to the water board to ensure minimum flows are met. Also, key tributaries are really important here, and they need to have a specified number, minimum flow numbers, because, for example, when minimum in-stream flow requirements were being met, Shackleford was sometimes running dry and causing strandings of endangered coho salmon. And then there's the diversion ditch right next door to the Bear River that's full of water and delivering irrigation water and a time when it should have water in it for salmon. In order to ensure these tributaries remain functional, it's necessary that gauges be placed in key tributaries to monitor fishery benefits for all life stages of salmonids. Um, and so, in closing, I would just like to request that the staff conduct biological and economic studies that evaluate baseline flows as well as recovery flows and ensure that economic studies assess the true costs associated with the loss of salmon as a staple diet for Indigenous people along the Klamath River. If you're including impacts to the local ag community, you also have to include impacts to Indigenous people, which is part of the racial equity policies adopted by this board. That said, I would like to thank the board and staff for all the work you've done this far to prioritize in-stream flows on the Scott and Shasta rivers. And I really do look forward to continuing our work together to develop adequate flows and see this recovery in the Scott and Shasta. It's a really incredible time right now with Klamath Dam removal. And, these salmon are coming back and these tributaries are really important to seeing, the repopulation of the upper basin. We're dependent on these tributaries. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and effort on this.